Hi, everyone. This is your Champlain College ambassadors, Chloe,
And Chloe.
and you are listening to Chamily Drama, broadcasting through the facilities of CFFF Trent Radio at 92.7 FM in Peterborough, Nogojawong, Canada.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 1 of Chamily Drama. To kick off this season, we have a very special episode featuring an interview with an instructor here at Trent named AJ Vosper. She does amazing research into feminism in horror movies. So kick back, relax, and let's learn about all things horror.
All right. Thank you, Amy Jane, for coming and being here with us on the radio show. First, I'd like to ask you to give a little bit of an introduction of yourself.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today. It is a pleasure to be here. So my name is Dr. Amy Jane Vosper, and I am a course instructor at Trent University. She, her pronouns, please. And I actually completed my dissertation and successfully defended it last spring.
And could you tell us a little bit about your research on women in the horror genre?
Yes, it is my pleasure. I'm always eager to talk chop shop, as I like to call it. So my dissertation was entitled Women in Horror on the Screen, in the Scene, and Behind the Screens. So I was very interested in looking at women's multidimensional infiltration of the horror genre. If you are familiar with the genre, you might know that we have seen an influx of female participation from behind the cameras to writing scripts to actually participating in the fan community. So it's been a really exciting time to actually look at horror and talk to the fans and talk to the filmmakers. So that was the goal of doing this research. I have been working in this arena since I started my master's many moons ago. And I continued on with my PhD because I realized there's still so much to say and there's still so much to look at here. And I've been very lucky because these fans and these filmmakers have been very excited to talk about their work and to get involved in these sort of research projects.
Awesome. And why do you think it's important to research the relationship between women and horror?
It's an excellent question. When I actually started doing my work in horror during my MA, I discovered that there seemed to be an absence of female the view of women who actually watch horror, not just those who are involved on the production side, but those who participate as fans. All the literature that I was reading in my master's just ignored female spectators. In fact, one of the most famous horror scholars, Carol J. Clover, who wrote Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is a wonderful book, but she actually says that she's going to refer to the female spectator as invisible because she thought that she didn't really exist. And I knew from personal experience there were lots of women out there that were watching horror and loving horror and participating in those fan communities. So it wasn't even necessarily my goal starting off to look at women in horror, but when I noticed this lack of research, when I noticed this absence in the literature, I felt like it was my responsibility to do something about it.
And what was your method for conducting research on this topic?
So actually, one of the strengths of my research is my combined methodology. I actually thought this was a weakness going into it, and my supervisor let me know that actually this is one of my strengths. So I had a little trouble deciding what perspective I wanted to take and how I wanted to begin this research. I started with theory, and then I thought maybe I wanted to do surveys, maybe I wanted to do interviews, maybe I wanted to focus specifically on theory, and in the end, I decided to do it all. So my first chapter looks specifically at theory and sort of the history of women's involvement, particularly women's representation on screen in horror. And then my second chapter, I interviewed self-identified female horror fans and talked about their consumption practices, looked at their demographics. I was really interested in sort of how they got involved in fandom and their first experiences. And then my third chapter, I did one-on-one interviews. Well, one of my interviews was with twins, so one-on-two interviews for one case. But I did interviews with women who were working on the production side of horror. So I combined all of these together, and then I looked at how this data all talked to each other and wrapped it all up in my conclusion. Again, I thought this was a weakness going in, but it turns out this approach is something that we don't see a lot when it comes to horror academia. So that kind of set my work apart a little bit.
Awesome. And what did you learn from the interviews that you administered?
I thought that it was really interesting that even though I spoke to, there were 3 interviews that I did. Like I said, one of them was with twins. So I spoke to 4 different women who worked in horror. And I was shocked by how similar their backgrounds were, particularly their first experiences getting into horror, that they all felt a little bit alienated and isolated in their youth, that their particular interests didn't seem to align with their peers. And then when they found the horror genre, and particularly the horror fandom community, that they suddenly felt that sense of community, that they felt like they had a place to belong. And it was really interesting that without even talking about that, they just all sort of volunteered that information. And it was really fascinating to see how these experiences aligned, even though these were women from all different places in Canada.
That's really cool. And did you learn anything about the topic that was unexpected or surprising to you?
Well, like I said, I came to this topic with a lot of personal information. So I had a lot of experiences and, of course, my own opinions going in. However, I was really interested in looking at that existing research, even though it was rather minimal at the time, and seeing if it was still relevant, because a lot of it was dated, and to see how it actually worked with these self identified female fans. And some of the surprising data that I found was that most of these fans were not incredibly young. So there seems to be this stereotype that horror fans are young, heterosexual males. And my experience was not that. So the majority of my women actually were in their later 30s. That was the average of my age. I actually had women from 18 to 56, I believe, was my range. So, but the vast majority of them actually fell in their 30s. So I thought that was really interesting because we sort of aligned, particularly fandom, but horror fandom, with youth. And that was a finding that didn't actually get proved by my work. And then another finding that I thought was really interesting was that most of these women actually began consuming horror in their childhood home with family members, which was also my personal experience, and again the experience of the women that I interviewed. But I was surprised I didn't know everybody. Well, so many of them had come to it from that same sort of background. So a lot of them watched with female family members as well, particularly mothers. That seemed to be the biggest one. But they also watched with their fathers and their brothers, but it seemed to be the female fans in the family tend to be the ones that they were most likely to be watching with. And the final piece of information that I received was we have this expectation that women don't consume horror because they're uncomfortable with graphic violence. And this is something that I see reiterated throughout literature all the time. And again, didn't align with my personal experience or the experiences of a lot of the women that I went to see horror with. We liked gory movies, we liked graphic violence. And the findings that I collected through my research also supported this idea that women aren't uncomfortable with graphic violence. In fact, a lot of them enjoy it. The kind of issue here is that women, as spectators, particularly for the horror genre, seem much more invested in a narrative. They want a story. They don't want gore for the sake of gore. So this led to the assumption that women don't like gory films, and that's not the case. When you combine a strong narrative and character development with that graphic violence, women are still going to enjoy it. But if it's just graphic violence, those tended to be the subgenres of horror that the women that I interviewed seemed to be a lot less interested in.
Hi, everyone. Once again, this is your Champlain College ambassadors, Chloe
And Chloe.
and you are listening to Chamily Drama, broadcasting through the facilities of CFFF Trent Radio at 92.7 FM in Peterborough, Nogojinawong, Canada.
All right, that's really interesting. Could you also tell us more about how female horror filmmakers are changing the representation of women in horror films?
So, in the past, there has been a lot of focus on women as victims in horror. This tends to be the most common feminist critique of the horror genre, is the victimization of women. And then we have Barbara Creed, a horror scholar, producing her work in the 90s, telling us that actually women are often portrayed as monsters in horror. And we saw sort of this shift to women, monstrous women. Her book is called The Monstrous Feminine, and I highly recommend it. It is my personal favorite horror theory book, particularly when we're talking about feminist approaches to horror theory. But she started talking about these different archetypes of female monstrosity and how actual women are threatening to men in general. That's why they like to portray monsters as being feminine, because there's this kind of enjoyment that we can get by watching men take down a female monster. Then we have Clover coming in and saying, actually, horror started focusing on placing women as the survivor. You might have heard the term the final girl before. This is our last standing woman in a horror film who usually rises up to fight against the monster. But the argument against this was that she's actually always coded as a man in drag. So, in other words, she tends to have very masculine attributes. She tends to have a masculine name. She also tends to have a base of knowledge that we associate more with masculinity than femininity or maybe androgyny. So, the idea that these final girls are actually not extremely feminine women as they're portrayed on screen. This was kind of the argument that Clover was making, that they might be women, but actually they're stand-ins for men. So I would argue that with the influx of female filmmakers and writers coming to the horror genre, we actually have seen a new representation. I like to call it the feminist monster, but she's an amalgamation of all of these prior archetypes. She is victimized, she is a monster, and she is also a survivor. In a lot of these films, we see her as the protagonist. She might be an anti-hero. Quite often, she has had some sort of wrong done to her, and she is seeking vengeance, and it does tend to often be on men, but sometimes it doesn't matter regarding gender. But this woman, she is unabashedly female. She has no problem using her sexuality or her femininity to get what she wants. She embraces her monstrosity. She is not afraid to let that darker side take hold, and she's not necessarily always punished for it, like we saw in older versions of horror where the female monster must be destroyed at the end of the film. In a lot of these representations of the feminist monster in the more contemporary horror film, she gets to survive. She might even get a franchise. So it's kind of an exciting time to be a horror fan, because we've seen these women who are coming into horror know that horror history. They understand that when they put something on screen, a lot of us fans have seen everything prior to that. So we know what to expect. So they subvert our expectations. And that's what's keeping horror innovative and original even nowadays.
Wow, that's really cool. That's definitely going to change the way that I think about horror movies when I'm watching them now. I'm going to be analyzing them for all those concepts. But that's awesome. Have women always been involved in the horror film industry? And if not, what's changed?
This is an excellent question, because I talk about women's multi-dimensional infiltration of horror as though it's this brand new phenomenon. And the fact is, women have been involved in horror since the inception of horror. There's actually a theorist named Alison Peirce. She is an incredible horror theorist, and she refers to women's involvement in horror as an invisible history. And it's true. We had women working in costume design. We had women editing scripts. We had women behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera in horror since the beginning of the genre. However, there just wasn't much of a celebration of them. There wasn't a lot of people talking or analyzing it. They were sort of ignoring women as though they were somehow the exception. And now I think we're recognizing women's involvement as it exists in contemporary cinema, but we're also taking this opportunity to look back and celebrate the women that actually paved the way for the rest of these women to sort of take the forefront now. They've always been there. They've just been, well, invisible.
Did you use the Bechdel test during your research, and why or why not?
For the most part, I didn't, simply because in these more contemporary horror films, particularly the ones I was analyzing for my work, they always would pass the Bechdel test. I don't think I would have talked about a film in my dissertation. Well, I wouldn't have analyzed one that didn't. And this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily acknowledge about horror, but this has actually been a genre where we've seen women on screen talking to each other with names, fighting back, even if they're unfortunately being victimized and killed at the end or partway through. Quite often we see conversations between women. This is a genre where we've seen women on screen getting more screen time than so many other genres. So a lot of these films do pass the Bechdel test without even trying. However, a lot of older horror films might not pass. So I didn't spend too much time talking about it, but it was always in the back of my mind. Is this the kind of film that would pass the Bechdel test? Is it worth talking about?
Awesome. And do you plan on continuing your research on women in horror? And can you give us a little bit of an idea of what that might look like?
So I have every intention of continuing to research women in horror and just horror in general. My intention was in my next writing project, I really wanted to look at queer representation in vampire films. And I thought that would be a really interesting way to go. There's a lot of literature on vampire films, so I'm still sort of working my way through it. But I keep having people reach out to me about the work that I've done so far about women in horror. I found myself cited in textbooks, which was phenomenal to me. And that's because I am doing this empirical research, and that's rather uncommon for research and literature done on the horror, particularly, again, women's involvement in horror. So I would like to move on and maybe, write about vampires and queerness, but I have a feeling that there's so much interest and so much demand for talking about women in horror that I don't think I ever could escape it, even if I wanted to. So I think my future has a lot of women in horror in it.
Can you name 3 horror films that you would recommend to beginner horror fans? I know, big question.
So if someone is interested in getting involved in horror, I very much recommend looking at what genres they do enjoy. Do you like a good love story? Because then there are so many horror films that revolve around a love story. One of my absolute favorites is Dracula. It is a story that has been told over and over again, so we can look at that from sort of the classic perspective. However, Francis Ford Coppola's version of Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992 is a beautiful and sensual vampire film. So if someone is interested in that love story but wants a little bit of horror, kind of a little bit of spice of horror, I highly recommend 1992's Dracula. If you're looking for that classic sort of slasher film, I recommend the original Halloween from 1978. There's not a lot of blood by today's standards. It is not scary, so you can have some fun with it. I also recommend from 1974 the Canadian horror film called Black Christmas. I actually argue that it started the slasher genre as we know it today, but a lot of people celebrate Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Halloween as starting the genre. I actually think it was Bob Clark's Black Christmas, but that's my personal opinion. Again, not a lot of gore. It's sort of that slow build, but it also adheres to that formula of the slasher film that we've come to appreciate. If you're looking for a straight up feminist horror film, I cannot recommend Ginger Snaps enough. Canadian horror film from 2000. It was actually written by a woman, and that really comes across. It has this wonderful sort of family drama undercurrent going on in it. It equates puberty with monstrosity, female sexuality with monstrosity. There's so many interesting things going on. I'm not going to lie, I'm not crazy about the end of it, but the rest of it is absolutely amazing. So I cannot recommend Ginger Snaps enough. And finally, if you happen to be a giant comedy fan, there are so many amazing horror comedies out there. And again, that's a really good way to sort of dip your toes in because it kind of takes that edge off. You're not just going to be scared the whole time. So one of my favorites from 1988 is Beetlejuice. It's just so much fun. Danny Elfman does the music. It's just a great little romp with a little bit of scariness to it. If you're looking for something for the kids, Hocus Pocus from 1993. I was actually scared of that as a child. I fully admit it. It has some scary moments, but it's also a lot of fun as well. Something like Ghostbusters, again, really good for the family, but also a little bit of scary. So if you're wanting to, again, dip those toes in, but you don't want someone to bite them right off, you might want to start with a horror comedy.
All right, that is so great. That's given me a ton of movies to add to my watch list. So I'm going to be very busy this spooky season. But that's great. Thank you so much for being here and doing this interview with us and sharing all that knowledge with us.
Chloe and Chloe, thank you so much for having me today. This was an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for listening. This has been your Champlain College ambassadors, Chloe
And Chloe.
and you are listening to Chamily Drama, broadcasting through the facilities of CFFF Trent Radio at 92.7 FM in Peterborough, Nogojinawang, Canada.